Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone. It's great to be here with you all. My name's Kathy Errington. I'm the Executive Director of the Helen Foundation, Aotearoa. We're a public policy think tank based at AUT in Auckland. So that's what you can see behind me there, a lovely view of central Auckland today. It's great to be here to have a timely conversation with author Max Rashbrooke about the topic of inflation and inequality ahead of Budget 2022. Last year, Max released from publishers Bridget Williams Books a significant book, Too Much Money, How Wealth Disparities Are Unbalancing Aotearoa New Zealand. My colleague Grace is going to drop a link in the chat to those of you who are interested to pick up a copy of the book. It's also available, of course, in libraries across New Zealand. Today, I'm keen to both revisit the themes Max touches on in this book about inequality and where it's tracking in New Zealand, and to also tackle directly the context we now find ourselves in, which is very different from the circumstances in which Max was writing the book. We now find ourselves with some of the highest levels of inflation since the 1990s. And what I'm interested to ask Max really is, what can politics do about it? This is not just an issue in New Zealand, it's an issue appearing across the world. Some of you may have seen on Wednesday, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison was at one point waving a chart around in a press conference that did show that Australia has somewhat lower inflation than other parts of the world. But the most striking thing from that chart was how high inflation is everywhere. So today I'm interested to drill into that a bit with our guest Max Rashbrooke, but just before I do, I need to run over a few housekeeping points about how this all works. My apologies to those of you who are regular viewers of our events. I know that this is already very familiar to you, but I do need to say it so that everyone knows how to participate. The first thing to note is that this is a webinar, not a Zoom call, so your camera is not on and your microphone is not on. It doesn't matter if you need to look after children or take a call, or if you're like the Deputy Mayor in Hamilton a few weeks ago and you need to vacuum topless, that's all fine. We cannot see or hear you. That doesn't mean though that we don't want to hear from you. We very much do. If you look along the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can see a Q&A function and a chat function. For those of you joining on Facebook, unfortunately, you're not able to use this functionality. But if you have a question, you can put it under the live stream and hopefully it will get moved across by my colleague, Tom. But the best option is to join on Zoom if you do want to be able to interact with the session today. So if you bring up that Q&A function, you don't only have to use it for your own questions, you can also like other people's questions and they will rise to the top of the list and it's more likely that I'll ask them. For the first half of the session, I'll ask some prepared questions, but the second half of the session, I'll draw totally from that Q&A. So please do ask questions so that I've got something to say. You'll also see along the bottom of your screen a chat function. We are going to put links in there to background reading material in case some of you want to read more deeply into some of the issues raised today. I, however, though, won't be watching that chat consistently, so don't put questions in there. I probably won't see them. So just to, you can also use the chat if you like to introduce yourself to everybody else attending today, so everyone can get a sense of who's in the virtual room. But just to recap, questions for Max in the Q&A and introducing yourself or picking up links to background reading material, that's in the chat. And finally, just before I kick into the proper discussion, just to note that we have a really broad audience today, which is great. Part of our mission at the Helen Foundation is to make these kind of pressing policy issues facing New Zealand, to make them available to everybody. That's why we organise events like this and open them up for free to the public. As a result, we have a variety of people joining today, from expert economists who could probably take the session if they wanted to, and we also have students who are probably coming across Max's work for the first time. So we're going to do our best to address a wide variety of interests that people are bringing to the session. So Max, firstly, thank you so much for your time today and thank you for being here. Your book last year, Too Much Money, is familiar to many of our viewers. One of our members actually claimed they got 5 copies of it for Christmas, all from different people. But just in case not everyone had such well-read and generous friends, could you tell us what was your book about?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Lovely to be here. Too much money is telling a story that has wealth inequality at its core, but goes beyond that to tell a set of wider stories about advantage and disadvantage across New Zealand in an intergenerational sense. It starts with the very large inequalities between rich and poor, exemplified in the fact that if you include the rich list in your figures, the wealthiest 1% of New Zealanders, that's about 40,000 people, own a quarter of all the household wealth in this country. So there's a very striking inequality there. But I thought the more interesting question is, what does that disparity between rich and poor mean for people's lives? And in the book, I trace all these different ways in which wealth can be converted into advantages that other people don't have. Better housing, and through better housing, better access to the most prestigious schools, from which the most prestigious university courses disproportionately recruit, higher incomes, greater political influence, all these ways that wealth buys other opportunities. And those are then passed down through the generations. And what I say ultimately is that if you have these very large inequalities across lots of different goods and things that matter, if that creates a hierarchy between top and bottom, and if there's some closure in that, if it's hard to move between those different strata, then what essentially you have is a class system. Even though that's a very unpopular term in New Zealand, I do think we're in danger of having a future that is much more stratified by class, and it's my concern about that that's really the main message of the book.
Thank you for that. And I see we've had a question come through asking, is this being recorded? And the answer is yes. We will upload it to YouTube and post on our social channels. You can also check the Helen Clark Foundation Facebook page, because that's where the recording will be available first. It should be available within minutes of this session ending. So going back to the issues you just raised, Max, it actually relates quite neatly to a question I received by email overnight from one of our members, Peter. So I'll just bring that in now. Peter asked, given how hard it is to mount anything politically in New Zealand that actually tackles the gross parameters of material inequality, for example, just look at how the debate on capital gains went down, where despite a policy consensus that New Zealand should have one, and the fact that New Zealand's almost the only OECD country not to have one, the wall of opposition was fulsome and unrelenting. Would it make more sense to try to ensure that every New Zealander enjoys a basic, acceptable standard of living and leave that as an achievable social policy goal, rather than trying to take on the much harder task of addressing material inequality?
Really interesting question there. I guess on a sort of limited pragmatic note, I would say first that I don't think the capital gains tax debate was always destined to end the way it did. Although, yes, there were very powerful forces arrayed against it. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that Labour had it as a policy up until 2014. Then Andrew Little scrapped it, well, sort of put it on the back burner. Then when Ardern became leader just before the 2017 election, she brought it back in, but wasn't really prepared to defend it. So then suddenly they came under a whole lot of criticism and said, oh, we'll put it to a tax working group. And then, of course, they were unable to defend their own idea for 18 months while the working group deliberated, and then they'd lost the debate. Whereas I think a Labour Party that had been organised and consistent and had been willing to front foot the debate about capital gains tax, right throughout for 7 or 8 years consistently, I think could have got it across the line, because there was always about 30 to 40% of people, according to the polling, who were willing to be convinced. So that would be my first point. My second point would be, I understand where you're coming from. And in a way, it seems like the most urgent task is to raise the bottom rather than to constrain the top. But the problem is you can't really separate them, because why do we not have a system that guarantees a decent standard of living to everyone who's poor? Well, I think it's because ultimately we have a value system, that says that people who are poor are somehow less worthy than others, and people who are rich are more worthy. And there's all these connections. I mean, why are wages so low? It's partly because so much of corporate income is now going to the owners of businesses rather than wage and salary owners. You can't understand poverty without understanding affluence, and just at a very fundamental level, to do all the things you want to see done, I suspect all of which I would agree with, you need a lot more tax revenue. And it is absolutely clear from talking to people inside the beehive that the reason they haven't done more on benefits, for instance, at the moment has not been public opinion, is that they just don't have the money. So actually, the failure to tackle the top end is what stops you from making progress at the bottom end.
We have kind of Scandinavian expectations of the welfare state, but a North American attitude to taxation, you could say. I was interested if you can put some numbers to what you were saying about wealth in New Zealand. How much money do you have to count as wealthy, or how much money do you need to earn?
There's different strata even within the wealthy. The hyper wealthy, the 0.01% is the rich list, essentially, and that's people with fortunes over $50 million. And they've got, something in the order of $100 billion between them. So you could say that that's the hyper wealthy. If you sort of widen that out a little bit and you're looking at that 1% I mentioned earlier, the people who own a quarter of the country, I haven't actually had time to do the analysis on the latest wealth data, which only came out a month or so ago. But to get into that group, you would probably, I'm just guessing, thinking about inflation since the last time I did the figures, that would probably be something like people with $10 million and upwards, or maybe sort of the high millions of dollars. And then we know from the last data release that to be in the top 10% of New Zealand by household, you need about $2 million. And it's worth remembering that's net worth. So that's what you own minus what you owe. Because you might say, well, gosh, there's an awful lot of houses in Auckland, say, that are worth over $2 million, but there will be really big mortgages held against a lot of those houses. So yeah, so if you want to be in that top 10%, the threshold for that as a household is about $2 million. And then you track down all the rest of the way through the population. And what's really notable is that when you come to the poorest half of New Zealand, the poorest 10th, the very poorest 10th for a start, are a negative net worth. Basically all that tranche of New Zealanders is they owe more than they own. And for the poorest half generally, they have so few assets, they have about 2% of the wealth of the entire country. So there's a really enormous inequality of wealth in a supposedly egalitarian country.
How much mobility is there between generations in New Zealand? So I asked this partly, we've done some research on this some time ago now. You may have better or more recent data on it, but we put a report out in 2020. I think my colleague Grace can drop a link in the chat to the full report if people are interested. But in our report, it was called Gains for Everyone, and we cited data from the OECD saying that New Zealand, a young person born into a low-income family in New Zealand on average needs 4 generations just to get to the average income. And the quickest country in the OECD was Denmark, and it was only 2 generations, but that still is too much if you're on the wrong end of that equation. So I was interested, how well do you think New Zealand does by this metric? Do you have other data on that?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I sometimes even find that mobility lens quite a limited one. If you're talking about how long does it take people to get from being in a poorer household to being in an average one, there's a question that's already gone begging, which is, why should we accept that people are poor in the first place? I wouldn't want our aim as a society to be that it's easy to get from deep poverty to an average income, because I don't think deep poverty should exist in the first place. So I tend to think more about measures. One measure I find that is intergenerational, but it is more useful because I don't think the assumptions behind it are so questionable, is the figure around how much of your income as an adult can be predicted from what your parents earned. Because that doesn't presuppose, I don't think, huge income gaps. But what it says is, to what extent is your life, your success in life, down to your own choices, versus how much can we predict from you having made the choice of the right parents, as people put it. And what we see from that data is that New Zealand is probably somewhere in the middle of the pack. The best performing country in the world, again, on this measure is Denmark. Only about 15% of your income there can be predicted from what your parents earned. So there is some transmission of advantage from generation to generation, but it's relatively small. In the US, by contrast, 50% of your income as an adult can be predicted from what your parents earned, which I think is really striking, because it suggests that half of your economic success in life has got nothing to do with the choices you made, even though we live in this world with this very intense rhetoric about everyone's responsible for their own choices and you get what you deserve in life. On this measure, the New Zealand data is frankly not very strong, but the best guess is that our figure is about 30%. Nearly a third of what you earn as an adult in New Zealand can be predicted from what your parents earned. So it's not terrible, it's not as bad as the US, but it's still quite a lot. And again, for a supposedly egalitarian country, I think that's quite a confronting statistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Turning towards budget 2022, we're obviously heading up. We've got a few weeks to go until the New Zealand budget comes out on the 19th of May. But the last budget had as its centrepiece reversing at least partially the cuts made in the so-called mother of all budgets in 1991, which I know we have some people joining who were not born when that happened. So what that refers to is a budget in 1991 from Finance Minister at the time, Ruth Richardson, who announced enormous spending cuts across a range of social welfare programs in the interests of controlling inflation. Of course, that budget did get on top of inflation, but it did it at a tremendous cost, and it remains a very controversial moment in New Zealand history. I think unemployment got close to 12%, but don't quote me on that. That's the context. When New Zealanders hear inflation and budgets in the same sentence, that's what for many of us, at least older ones, the students you watching now, I know you probably just heard the term mother of all budgets, but for the rest of us, that's what we think of. So Max, what are you expecting in budget 2022? Are you expecting new spending like the last one, or do you think the new fiscal rules are going to prevent that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. And since you mentioned the mother of all budgets in the 1990s, I wonder if we could just show one of a couple of slides that I prepared, because it's interesting to think about the wider context. And this is a graph about what has happened to the incomes of 4 typical groups in New Zealand since the 1980s. Adjusted for inflation. You've got the poorest 10% at the bottom, then the middle, sort of the typical New Zealander, someone in the richest 10%, and then someone in the richest 1%. And without going too much into the detail here, what's really obvious is that the mother of all budgets was just part of a series of things that happened in the 80s and 90s that, to put it really simply, constructed an economy where the bulk of economic growth, the bulk of the new rewards went to those who were already doing the best. Over a really long period of time, as you can see from the graph, incomes for the poorest New Zealanders, and indeed even average New Zealanders, haven't increased very much, perhaps 30–40% over a really long period of time. So it's not just a story about poverty, it's a story about middle New Zealanders missing out as well. Conversely, incomes for people in the richest 10% have more than doubled in that time. But then finally, incomes for the richest 1%, the top line, that's pre-tax income, whereas the others are post-tax income, so they're not strictly comparable. There's some various data issues that I won't get into. So this is that top line is really just illustrative, but it does show how certainly pre-tax incomes for the richest 1% really skyrocketed, from the mid-1980s onwards. So yes, the government over the last 4 or 5 years has done some, I think, has made some positive moves, and it's increased benefits quite sharply, up to $90 a week for core benefits. They've done that incrementally over time. That has started to reverse some of the damage that was done in the 80s and 90s, but there's still a long way to go before core benefits, get as sort of regain the relationship they had with the average wage that they had in the 80s and 90s. So there's a huge amount more to do, but do I really expect to see a great deal more in the budget? Not really, unfortunately. I think it's been well signalled that a lot of the focus will be on climate change. Ostensibly, there's this huge spending allowance, in quote, 6 billion or so, but a lot of that will just be taken up with meeting inflationary pressures in the public sector generally. And and beyond that, there isn't actually a vast amount of money to splash around. And I think the government is, probably feels like it's done what it's going to do substantially on benefits in this term. I may be proven wrong, but I'm not actually particularly optimistic that the budget will make a huge amount of progress on the social front.
And your mention of inflationary pressures relates to a question we've got from Laura that's come in. And this relates to what I had scripted next. So I've kind of merged the two. So we hear a lot about how government spending is inflationary. So that's the idea that if we do things like spend more money on benefits, for example, it will just pass through the economy as higher prices. And if the net effect of that means it's kind of pointless, right? Like if everything starts to cost more, your benefit is worth less anyway. And that's why inflation is such a difficult problem. So I'm interested to talk to you, Max, about, well, what can politics actually do? The spending on issues like benefits obviously helps address the impact to people vulnerable to inflation, but it can make the problem worse. And so what are the options on the table? Are there any?
Yeah, again, a great question. There's a whole lot of interlinked issues there. Firstly, I think a lot of it is outside of the government's control. It's well rehearsed, obviously, that a great deal of the inflation we're experiencing is being experienced everywhere else in the world, which tells you it's not anything specific to what our government is doing. Supply chain disruptions because of COVID, Ukraine, China's COVID response, those are all things that, in my view, are principally driving inflation. And you have to remember that even where inflation shows up as occurring in domestic areas, the things like the non-tradable sector, a lot of things that that are part of the domestic economy actually rely massively on inputs from overseas anyway. So I think it's very hard to say that any or much of the inflation has been generated domestically. Is government spending contributing to that? Well, I haven't really seen any compelling argument that it is. And the government's line on this, which I happen to think is largely correct, is would it be sensible in any case to stop the forms of spending that they have planned? I mean, a lot of the spending that's pointed at, like rail and things like that, isn't even happening yet and won't happen for a long time. Things like the health sector reorganisation, I've got my doubts about some of that, but absolute health sector reform is needed. I don't think New Zealand would be better off if we stopped spending that money, and it's doubtful what impact it would have on inflation anyway. So what can the government do? Really, in the short term, I think all it can do is cushion the impact on those worst off. And we do have to continue the benefit increases and the minimum wage increases, because otherwise the situation for the hardest hit will just deteriorate even further. I don't think that's likely to turn into a spiral where prices forces wages to rise and then wages forces prices to rise, because frankly, I just don't think wages are going to rise that much. Other than the government's minimum wage increases, I don't see a strong enough New Zealand union movement, frankly, to drive the kind of wage increases that might lead to that kind of spiral. And lastly, on that question of, is there any point in these measures because things just get passed through to consumers in the form of higher costs? Of course, there's an element of that, and as you say, that is why inflation is difficult. But firstly, I don't think that's always true. Contrary to popular belief, for instance, we know that when the government increases benefits and accommodation supplement, rents do not go up by the same amount. rents do go up. There's some landlord capture, but landlord capture is not even anywhere near 100%. So there is a point in increasing people's incomes generally. Where it does get problematic is areas where firms don't face a lot of competition, because it's really easy for them to pass on cost pressures and hike prices. And we have a big long-term problem that there isn't enough competition in a lot of the key sectors where we see the most inflation. And groceries, supermarkets is one of the classic cases of that, terribly uncompetitive. But you could talk about building materials as well. You could talk about electricity prices, all kinds of things, fuel retailing. The problem is there's no quick fixes for those areas, but if we want to be inflation-proofed in future, I would be focused on really trying to turbocharge competition in those very uncompetitive sectors of the economy.
We've got some more questions coming in. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start drawing more and more on that from now on. So if there's anything you'd like to see me put to Max, just pop it in the Q&A function that you see along the bottom of the Zoom screen. The first question has come in from Nikki, saying she would love your thoughts on the speech David Parker made this week about the proposed tax bill, particularly in relation to the inclusion of capital income. And I'd just add to that, Max, could you start off by explaining what he said?
Yeah, absolutely. So Revenue Minister David Parker gave a speech yesterday, which was essentially a response to the government's failure to move the dial really on tax issues this term. And what he was trying to do, I think, was point to a longer term agenda around tax. And that had two elements, one of which wasn't new, but nonetheless was the project he has underway to essentially get the IRD to go and talk in great detail to New Zealand's wealthiest people. So this is the rich list, essentially, and actually get good data on what wealth they hold, what their true income is once you include things like capital gains and inheritances, which aren't counted as income by the tax system, but which are, in my view, in fact, income, and try to establish how much tax they're paying, because we have very poor data on those people, the wealth they hold and the tax they pay, because they don't fill out the household surveys that the rest of us are perfectly willing to fill out. So that's part one, that's getting better data on that. And then part two of what Parker announced is that he wants to introduce a Tax Principles Act, which would say there are generally agreed principles of the tax system, that it should treat people fairly who are in similar circumstances, that there should be some element of progressivity, it should be reasonably efficient, and it shouldn't distort investment decisions. And then require regular reporting by officials against how well New Zealand's tax system measures up to those principles. And he couched that as being something that would be good in itself, that would help improve the public debate, in his view, around taxation and minimize some of the forms of misinformation. But I think you can also say that he thinks that in the long term, if there were regular reporting, particularly on things like how little tax the wealthy pay on their income when you include capital gains tax and inheritances and things like that, that would build long-term support for the kinds of tax changes, the introduction of a capital gains tax or a wealth tax, that the government has been unable to make really any progress on this term. So essentially it was trying to lay the groundwork for future changes, I think.
So we've got a question come in from a year 12 student, Josh, asking, what's your opinion about fair pay agreements as proposed by Minister Michael Wood? Do you think this will address some of the issues you've raised about lifting incomes for low income earners?
Yes, I do. I think fair pay agreements are a really sensible policy. Versions of them exist in a lot of other countries, notably Australia. I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that if, as workers, you enjoy good terms and conditions in a particular firm, you should be able to apply to have those terms and conditions spread right across that industry. It's very difficult to get out there and organise firm by firm. Our laws don't make it particularly easy. Our trade union movement is quite weak. And so in every given industry, you have some good employers who are paying well and providing good conditions. And then you have an awful lot of people trying to undercut them. You have a lot of cowboys, frankly. And what the fair pay agreements would essentially do was allow workers to get, terms and conditions lifted right across an industry, so it stopped the good employers being undercut by the cowboys, and basically create a higher minimum floor in a given industry. So I think that makes a lot of sense. It'd be particularly valuable for workers in supermarkets, in retail and hospitality, all those kinds of industries that are characterized by a lot of precarious work, insecure work, short-term contracts. My only caveat about fair pay agreements is I don't think they'll go far enough. For me, one of the most striking facts about New Zealand in the last few decades, and it's related to that chart that I showed you about the widening disparity in rich and poor, is that the proportion of corporate income that goes to the owners of businesses has increased from about 50% to 60% over that time period. And there's been a corresponding decrease in the share of corporate income that goes to workers. And the equivalent of that, the effect of that is that the average wage in New Zealand is currently $14,000 a year less than it would be if we hadn't had that shift of the flow of income away from workers and towards owners. That's a huge shift, $14,000 every year for every person who's on the average wage. It's a massive income loss that the people are experiencing. And I don't think fair pay agreements by themselves are going to unwind a huge amount of that era-defining shift.
We've got a question in from Tom asking, what are your thoughts on the Finance Minister's proposed return to his pre-COVID fiscal restraint policy?
I think it's a political decision in the most naked sense. It's just like the budget responsibility rules. There was no economic necessity behind them. There is, for me, no convincing economic rationale that says you need to get public debt down to these really extraordinarily low levels where it's sitting at 20% of GDP. There are plenty of countries around the world that have, where their governments owe 100% of GDP or even greater than that, and they've not run into any economic problems. Yes, we are a small nation. We're particularly exposed to the winds of economic change. Ratings agencies might look more skeptically on us if our debt rates started getting up, to those heights. So maybe we have a little bit less room to maneuver than some other countries, but I don't think significantly so. And the argument is made, we have to pay down debt so that we're insured against the next economic shock. But getting debt down to 30% of GDP, I don't see how that buys you any insurance that you don't already have when debt is at 40% of GDP. I think these are very arbitrary numbers. So I think we're far too concerned about paying off debt. And I also think the government should be much bolder about generating more revenue, but it's obviously taken the political decision that it can't do that. Labour has a long-standing weakness on the economy. It is petrified as being seen as weak at managing the economy. And so it does all these things to try to inoculate itself against those kinds of attacks.
And so that leads into another question I've got by email from Peter, our member, who asked actually a question just before, but he's interested in your views on one of the other measures being proposed to address inequality. Broadly speaking, in New Zealand, the government has signalled that it will pursue a social insurance scheme. And what that is it's a lot like ACC in the way that you're covered by ACC if you get injured in an accident or if you're injured at work. The proposal is that you will have insurance cover like that if you get made redundant or if you get so sick that you cannot work. This is a pretty new territory for New Zealand to go into. We currently have very little protection for people who are made redundant. So Peter, our member, thinks that it's a great idea, but that it needs more childcare added in to support, to make it actually practical for people to take advantage of. And he was interested in your views of it. I've of course heard it criticised by other groups as a kind of Koru class dole. So what's your perspective?
Yeah, a little bit like with fair pay agreements. I am broadly supportive of it. And a bit like fair pay agreements, it's something that's absolutely standard around the world. We are one of, I think, only 2 or 3 developed countries that doesn't have some form of social insurance. And particularly in Scandinavia, with the welfare states that we often look up to and which are much more generous than ours, social insurance is a core part of that. So in those countries, you face a small levy on your income, something like 1% of your salary, and your employer contributes a similar amount. And that means that initially, when you lose your job, for say 6 or 9 months after you lose your job, you get a payment that's linked to your previous earnings. And only at the end of that period do you go down onto the standard core benefit rate. I think there's a good philosophical justification for this. Job loss is incredibly traumatic and disruptive. The evidence shows that half of New Zealanders lack the savings they would need to sustain themselves at the poverty line for even 3 months. So we have a huge tranche of New Zealanders who aren't necessarily poor, but who are very vulnerable to economic shocks. The evidence is also in New Zealand that after you lose your job, even 5 years later, you're earning something in the order of 15 to 20% less than you were before you lost your job. So job loss is this huge impact on people, and that's partly because people lose their job, they panic, they go for the first job that's available, even though it's a terrible match for their skills and isn't fulfilling and isn't really the job they should be in, and then they get stuck there. So I think there's a really good rationale for social insurance. Essentially, you tax people a little bit while they're in work and you make their employers contribute. The proposal also brings in compulsory redundancy in New Zealand for the first time ever. So there's a month of compulsory redundancy bundled into the proposal, which I think is an excellent idea. And then essentially the state, pays that back to the people who need it, and they cushion the shock of job loss. They give people time to hold things together. They don't have to sell their house just because they've lost their job. Give them time to search for the right job, get back into work, and hopefully at the same income level that they were experiencing beforehand. So I think there's a really strong rationale for that philosophically. Politically, I think it's also noteworthy that these social insurance schemes are at their most generous in the countries that also have the highest core benefit levels. So I think they help build middle-class support for the welfare state. And it's also noteworthy that within the paid workforce, the people who would make most use of this scheme are the lowest paid workers, because the evidence is that they lose their jobs most often. Job churn, job loss is highest amongst people who are on the minimum wage or just above it, a group of people who also tend to be disproportionately Māori and a range of other characteristics of people that we might seek to help particularly. So within the workforce, it's quite a progressive idea. The problem, of course, and Kathy has alluded to this, is that it can be seen as creating a 2-tier welfare system, and to some extent it does. And I think the argument to that as well, that is just a standard part of welfare systems in the developed world for a bunch of reasons. Partly it's doing something different to the standard benefit system. Also, it's only for a limited period of time. You're talking about 6 to 9 months, something like that. It's not a permanent 2-tier system. And it is also a political choice. It is going to be really expensive. The proposal is for something that costs in the order of $3 billion a year. And if it were up to me, I would spend that money in the core benefit system first. But the government has obviously taken the decision that if you said people, we're going to put 1% levy on you and a 1% levy on your employer, and we're going to give it all to beneficiaries, they would just be turfed out of office, quicker than you can say go. And so this is a realpolitik policy, but I think for all that it's worthwhile. And then just briefly on your point about childcare, I think that's partly a separate issue. yes, childcare hasn't really had any substantial change, I guess, since the notionally 20 hours free ECE, not really free, but never mind, was introduced under the Helen government. And so it's overdue an overhaul, I think. I'm not an expert on that, though, so I probably wouldn't be able to say exactly what needs to happen in that area.
And you mentioned the political calculations at stake, and Philippa has sent in a question, I think, that presents perhaps one of the alternatives to pursuing something like income insurance, which I would say is more of that kind of social protection Scandinavian model of social welfare. But one alternative idea you hear bandied around is universal basic income. What do you think about that idea? Philip is asking, do you think that idea has died?
I think it has, well, it never dies. The UBI has been advocated in some form or another. You could argue going all the way back to Thomas Paine in the 18th century. I think it is pretty well off the agenda for the moment. I happen to think that's a good thing. I really understand why people support a UBI, and I admire a lot of the motives that people are bringing to that discussion. But I just think it's a completely unworkable proposal, simply for cost reasons. I don't think people would abuse it. I think if you give money to people unconditionally, most people are good people, and the evidence is that people use it well. It's just, it's a cost problem. When a UBI has been proposed in New Zealand, it's normally been proposed at the rate of the current core benefit, the unemployment benefit, which is in the order of about $13,000 a year. But to give everyone in the country $13,000 a year, even assuming some savings, you're talking in the order of about $30 billion. And it's just a colossal sum of money. So that's like a third of government spending, a quarter or a third of government spending. So, and the tax increases you would need for that would just be eye-watering. There's no way you would ever, not in a million years, get them across the line. And moreover, you would be spending that huge amount of money without it necessarily increasing by a single cent the amount of money that's going to the poorest New Zealanders. They'd only be better off if they happen to get work along with the UBI, but there's no guarantee that that will happen. So you're spending a colossal amount of money to not help those most in need while giving $13,000 a year to millionaires and billionaires. I mean, it just doesn't stack up. And if you tried to pay it at a rate where, you know, at say the rate of New Zealand Super, where it would really be improving the lives of beneficiaries, well, you're just taking its unaffordability and turbocharging that problem of it. So I just don't think it has any kind of future as an idea. If one were going to do radical welfare reform, I would be more likely to support something like a guaranteed minimum income, which essentially is a benefit that you can get, no questions asked. So it's unconditional at the bottom end, but it is abated, it is clawed back from you as you earn more money from the conventional paid workforce. So it's like a UBI in the sense that if you've got no other income, you're tethered at the rate of New Zealand Super so that people could live with dignity, they could lead good lives even if they were on a benefit. But as they got back into the paid workforce and earned more, it would be gradually, slowly, clawed back. And so then it would be broadly affordable because you're not paying it to the whole population. It would still be really expensive if you set it at the rate of New Zealand Super, which is, ballpark $23,000 a year, something like that. That would cost something in the sort of, low billions to billions of dollars. It'd still take a lot of tax to fund it, but it's in the realms of what is possible, I think, and it would give help to those who need it, and for people who are accessing benefits, it would sweep away most, though not all, of the means testing and the hoops and the degrading tests and the questions and the wins, interrogations of every aspect of your life. You'd still have issues around income testing, some of those means testing, how much of the income do people lose as they get into the paid workforce. But those are all design issues that you can deal with. And at least with the guaranteed minimum income, you're starting from something that is fundamentally workable in a way that, for me, the universal basic income just isn't.
It's the idea of guaranteed minimum income is something we've touched on in our reports into loneliness, because of course there's such a strong association between being on a very low income and being socially isolated. And one aspect I thought I would add to what you said that we thought was worthwhile in exploring guaranteed minimum income is and something that could be perhaps done sooner than some of the other measures is the idea of individualizing the entitlement to, whether you call it a benefit or a guaranteed minimum income doesn't really matter, but at the moment, and again, this is something you don't always have good visibility of if you're not directly receiving a benefit, but it goes to the household, not to the individual, the entitlement. So if you get a partner, if you're a single person and you start dating someone and you're on a benefit, within a very, very short space of time, that person is expected to support you financially. And that's what prompts an enormous level of really what I would see as privacy violations with beneficiaries. That whole process of determining should you be being supported by a partner. So yeah, the report we mentioned that in is called Alone Together, if you're keen to check that out. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, and I would just add to that to say I agree absolutely, and I think one of the other, even though I disagree with them, one of the useful things that universal basic income advocates have done is draw attention to the problems in the current system, and one of which absolutely is the way that your income, your eligibility for a benefit depends on what your partner's income is, and the intrusions into people's privacy are just appalling. So I think yes, with a guaranteed minimum income, you could make it individualized, at least partly. Even the current benefits, even if we did nothing else other than to say, if your partner is earning under $50,000 a year, we're going to disregard that in terms of your eligibility for a benefit. Or for the first 3 years that you're together, a little bit like the way divorce property is treated in divorce settlement relationships generally, for the first 3 years, you're not counted as being in a couple for economic purposes. So if we did that, and then that would remove that incredible intrusiveness at the bottom end, while also ensuring that we're not paying the benefit to people whose partners are earning millions of dollars a year, which I think is something we don't want to do in the welfare system. So yes, we have to make some kind of movement on that intrusiveness and those privacy concerns.
Yeah, me and Max were pulling our punches a little bit, specifying what some of those intrusions were, but you can look up the Privacy Commissioner who put out some very sobering material on this a few years ago now, but if you look up Privacy Commissioner and beneficiaries, you'll see it included things like nude photographs that people had sent their partners were turned over by phone companies. So you're talking just extremely personal material that gets drawn into benefit investigations. I've got some questions that have come in now that are on a similar theme. So one's from Ian, and it's going back to your comments about David Parker's recent intervention talking about taxation. And basically what Minister Parker was doing was setting up a strategy that more information will build public support for tax changes over time. And Ian was interested, do you think this is going to work? And if it isn't, what else would help?
It's a very interesting question. And at David Parker's speech, I posed essentially the same question directly to him, because I'm not always convinced that providing more information does change people's minds. I think we all know a lot now about how people make up their minds based often, sadly, on feelings and stereotypes or some deeply rooted values. That said, I think information can be incredibly powerful, especially if framed the right way and repeated over time. Pardon me. And one piece of information that I think is powerful that isn't out there often enough, and that this kind of regular reporting would get out there, is the fact that according to the IRD's best guess, nearly half of New Zealand's wealthiest people are paying a lower rate of tax on their income than people on the minimum wage do. In New Zealand, on the first $14,000 of your income, every bit of income, in theory, you pay 10.5% in tax, but 40% of New Zealand's wealthiest people pay 10% or less of their income in tax. Partly because so much of it is capital gains, which isn't really taxed in this country properly, partly because there's all sorts of other avoidance mechanisms. Now, that's only a guess, and Parker's point is they need to do further research to establish what the true number is, but that seems to be the ballpark. And I think that is really shocking. People who are worth more than $50 million are paying less of their income in tax than people who are working in a supermarket as a supermarket cashier. So I think there is some power in information. I think his hope is also that this reporting framework would operate a little bit like things like the Public Finance Act are supposed to have worked, in the sense that if you set up this framework whereby governments have to report on how much they're spending, how much debt they're carrying, are they making progress towards prudent levels of debt, the sheer fact of that intellectual framework and the reporting behind it changes the premise of debate, it changes where people are looking, it shifts attitudes in the long term. Is he right about that in this context? I'm honestly not sure. Like you, I'm a bit skeptical. But, bluntly, at the moment, Labour is out of other options, and this might be about the best they can do.
I suppose it's a pitch for the value of high-profile advocates drawing attention to that information. But we've got a bit of a change in, I suppose, direction here, but I think it's a very good question, so I wanted to sound you out on it. New Zealand is well known as a low productivity economy. Is this one of the barriers we need to overcome in order to address inequality? I feel like productivity is the perennial question in New Zealand politics.
Yes, and in New Zealand webinars. But it's an excellent question. I do think low productivity is a problem, but the conclusions that I draw from that aren't necessarily the same conclusions that are drawn. For a long time, we've had a low-wage, low-skilled economy, and I think that's partly because, well, we had an unsustainable, very protected, overly protected economy in the late 70s and early 80s, and then we sort of flipped to this economy with a very, very hands-off government, and actually neither of those approaches is particularly effective, I think. If you want greater productivity, you need to invest in people, crudely speaking, and that can be better government investment in skills and training. I think we do vocational education particularly poorly in this country, but I also think we have a business sector that doesn't invest very much. If you look at their investment in their workforce's skills, it's also very low. New Zealand business investment in things like research and development is I think, is low by international standards. And we have a bit of an attitude amongst New Zealand businesses, I think, that their workers are a cost rather than an asset. And I think that needs to change. I think there's a reasonable degree of evidence that, you don't need to boost productivity and that allows you to raise wages. Actually, often raising wages is what drives productivity. And this is really clear from the research about the living wage internationally, and it's the reason why, firms like KPMG in the UK, when I lived there, were the biggest advocates of the living wage, because when they paid their cleaners the living wage, they turned up to work on time more often, worked harder when they were there, and didn't quit as often. And, churn is incredibly costly for businesses. So, often I think raising wages, raising investment is what will then give you the productivity. And the last point is that since, I think, 1991, there have been increases in productivity in New Zealand, not as much as there should have been, but there have been. But wage increases have fallen well behind those productivity gains. And so if you think that workers should get increases, even if you think they should get increases only when productivity increases, on that measure, New Zealand workers are due an immediate $6 an hour increase in their pay, because wage increases have fallen about $6 an hour below where they should be if they had matched productivity. So yes, there is a story around wages and productivity, but it is actually one of, we've had productivity, we've not had the wage increases, and we need to flip that round, get the wage increases first, and then a lot of the productivity will flow from that, I think.
So we've I'm not going to, unfortunately, get through every question. Sorry to anyone whose question doesn't get asked, but I thought it would be worth finishing on a note specifically about the budget, given that was the prompt for today's event, and we do only have time for the one more. So I'm interested in your answer to this question that's come in from one of our members saying, given the government's focus on climate change, this budget, which they've signalled publicly, are you worried about a danger that some climate policies, for example, increasing the ETS cap, congestion charging is another example, might be brought in that cause issues from a perspective of equity and inequality?
Yes, I am, absolutely. And funnily enough, I'm doing a webinar next week to the Nelson Climate Forum on exactly this topic, the nexus of inequality and climate change. Which is important, firstly, because the richest New Zealanders, people in the top 10%, have carbon emissions on average about 3 times that of the typical New Zealander. So climate change is substantially a problem that's caused by the wealthy, and that's also true globally, of course. It's wealthy nations by and large that have done the most emitting. So that has to be part of the analysis of the problem. And then, yes, there's a real danger that the solutions will increase costs, particularly for people at the lower end who are most unable to bear them. So we have to have what's called a just transition, which is a phrase that will be familiar to some people here, although not all. The transition to a low carbon economy has to be a just one. It has to be one that looks after the interests of the worst off. And I think that is certainly something that rhetorically the government acknowledges. It certainly the government understands that's an issue. But again, I'm not convinced that it's really delivered on that, partly because how do you ensure a just transition? Well, there's a couple of ways. One is that you ensure that there's protections for people who are in work in carbon intensive industries that are going to be put out of work. Social unemployment insurance, which we talked about earlier, would actually help with that, but I don't think there's been enough done to really put plans in place for people whose skills are suddenly going to be redundant and who will need a lot of investment, reinvestment in them, retraining in order to fill the new jobs that the economy will create. And then secondly, of course, the other way that you cushion the impact of climate change policies on the poorest is further benefit increases. And as I said, I'm worried that the government feels like it's done as much as it's going to, or it's done most of what it's going to, or it's done as much as it can do given political realities. So, and it's not clear, like I said earlier, how much of this budget is going to do much on the social front, if the emphasis is going to be on climate in the sense of investment in climate-specific policies. So I absolutely think you're right to draw attention to that, and that'll be one of the big tests for the budget. What does it do on climate, but also what does it do on the just transition?
Yeah, and on that point, we'll wind up our session today. Thank you so much for joining us, Max. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to all of you who've joined. If you're interested, you can sign up for a free newsletter from the Helen Clark Foundation on our website to be kept up to date with when we have events like this, if you'd like to attend again in future. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member. You can do both of those things on our website. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Max, for coming and for your time. And I hope you enjoyed the session. See you later.